on advice of the chairman of the NRC, and in the interest of taking every precaution, I am advising those who may be particularly susceptible to the effects of any radiation, that is, pregnant women and preschool-aged children, to leave the area within a 5-mile radius of the 3 Mile Island.
Five, 7, 2, 1.
The 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant sits in a densely populated area of Pennsylvania, not far from the city of Harrisburg. Construction began in 1968 on a small island known as 3 Mile Island. The goal was simple: to supply the region with cheap, reliable electricity, built beside a large body of water. The plant relied on it to provide the massive amounts of cooling water needed to keep its nuclear reactors safe and stable. Early in the morning, on March 28, 1979, silence over the 3 Mile Island plant was broken. A malfunction struck Reactor Unit 2, triggering the most serious nuclear accident in American history. Deep inside the reactor core, temperatures began to spiral out of control. Metal started to melt, systems failed, and a partial meltdown began. Radioactive gases leaked into the air, spreading fear across the region. The event would later be classified as Level 5 on the International Nuclear Event Scale. The 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant consisted of 2 pressurized water reactors, or PWRs for short. Each reactor unit was housed inside a massive concrete containment structure. The reactor vessel itself was made of thick steel, sealed at the top with a heavy lid that held the fuel loading mechanisms and the control rods. Inside the core were 170 fuel assemblies, and each assembly contained about 200 slender tubes. Inside every tube was uranium dioxide, serving as the reactor's fuel, while the tube walls were made of a corrosion-resistant zirconium alloy. During the chain reaction, these fuel assemblies produced an enormous amount of heat. That heat was carried away by the primary coolant, water circulating through the reactor core. As it passed through, the water heated up to nearly 300 degrees Celsius before flowing into the steam generator. There, heat was transferred to the secondary circuit, a separate closed loop of water. The two systems never mixed. Heat passed only through the metal walls of the steam generator. The result was high-pressure steam in the secondary loop, powerful enough to spin the turbine rotors, which in turn drove the electric generators, producing energy for thousands of homes. After passing through the turbine, the steam was cooled in a condenser using water from a third circuit drawn from the plant's cooling towers, and then reused in the cycle once again. No one can say for certain what exactly caused the accident at 3 Mile Island. Even today, the true chain of events remains partly a mystery. But what we do know is this: a whole series of small failures, mistakes, and oversights came together, leading to disaster. It began around 4 a.m. on March 28, 1979. Inside the control room, operators suddenly noticed alarming readings. The feedwater pumps of the secondary circuit had stopped. The loss of water circulation immediately caused a rise in temperature and pressure inside the primary circuit. At first, this wasn't considered dangerous. Emergency pumps were designed for such a situation. They automatically switched on within seconds. The reactor safety system also responded instantly, lowering the control rods and shutting down the nuclear reaction. But there was a hidden problem. Although the emergency pumps were running, the valves that allowed water to circulate were closed, and the operators didn't know it. The indicator lights that could have revealed this were covered by maintenance tags left from the previous day. Just hours before the accident, workers had been trying to clean a clogged pipe in the secondary circuit, blocked by ion exchange resin. They used compressed air for nearly 11 hours, and it's believed that this damaged a check valve, allowing water to enter the plant's pneumatic system. That same pneumatic system was used to control the valve actuators, and once water got inside, they began to malfunction. This failure is now considered one of the main causes of the accident. A reactor cannot be shut down instantly. Even after shutdown, residual heat continues to build up in the core, as pressure and temperature kept increasing. A safety relief valve on the pressurizer opened to release excess water and steam. But when the pressure returned to normal, the valve failed to close. Boiling water continued to flow into a storage tank called the bubbler tank. The bubbler tank overflowed, its ruptured disc burst, and as a result, hot radioactive water together with steam began to enter the containment building. 2 minutes after the reactor shut down, the emergency core cooling system activated, supplying cold water to the reactor core. But due to the valve malfunction, this water also drained into the containment area. 8 minutes later, operators discovered that the valves in the secondary circuit were closed and reopened them. But by then, the damage had already been done. The leak continued, and the operators still had no idea how much coolant had been lost. As coolant escaped from the primary circuit, steam began to form, pushing what remained of the water into the pressurizer. Believing that the system was still full of water, based on incorrect instrument readings, the operators made a fatal mistake. They shut off one of the emergency pumps and later stopped the circulation pumps as well, after noticing vibrations. By around 6 a.m., the water level in the reactor core had dropped so low that parts of the fuel assemblies became exposed. They overheated to more than 2,000 degrees Celsius, and the zirconium cladding began to melt. The extreme heat triggered a zirconium steam reaction, producing explosive hydrogen gas. The operators had no idea that the reactor was now completely out of control. At 6:20 a.m., the first shift personnel arrived and finally discovered the loss of coolant. They managed to close the isolation valve, stopping the leak, but it was already too late. An hour later, the emergency and circulation pumps were restarted, but the contact between cold water and molten fuel formed a solid crust, preventing water from reaching the center of the core. The coolant filled only part of the reactor vessel, slightly reducing the temperature, but steam and gas pockets blocked full circulation. Inside, the temperature rose beyond 2,500 degrees Celsius. The molten radioactive mass slowly burned its way downward toward the bottom of the reactor vessel. Wednesday, March 28th. For the residents of Harrisburg, it was just another ordinary spring morning. People were heading to work. Children were on their way to school. Shopkeepers opened their stores. No one could have imagined that only a few kilometers away, a silent tragedy was unfolding. One that could have become the worst technological disaster in U.S. history, and in the worst-case scenario, could have claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The molten core, containing nearly 50 tons of uranium, could, in theory, have burned through the bottom of the reactor vessel, then through the concrete foundation, and eventually reached the soil and groundwater below. If that had happened, the highly radioactive material could have contaminated the entire region. That same morning, news of the accident reached journalists, and soon after it was broadcast on every local radio station. By noon, rising radiation levels were being detected in the control room, and even along the ventilation stack of the turbine building. Throughout the day, operators made multiple attempts to vent steam from the containment building, but all of them failed. Only by the evening were most of the steam and gas pockets finally removed, and the reactor's temperature began to stabilize. It seemed that the worst had been avoided, but that was not the end. The next day, March 29th, Roger Matson, a nuclear engineer and member of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, reviewed the plant's computer data and delivered shocking news. Due to the zirconium steam reaction, a massive amount of hydrogen gas had accumulated under the reactor head and inside the containment structure. It could explode at any moment. Such an explosion would blast radioactive steam and nuclear fuel into the atmosphere, and the wind would carry it across the region. According to early estimates, the result would be catastrophic, potentially killing tens of thousands of people in a matter of hours. That meant one thing: an urgent evacuation of nearly 500,000 residents within a 10-mile, 16-kilometer zone around the plant. Governor Richard Thornburg was stunned by the news, and the situation grew even more alarming after a new radiation survey was carried out by helicopter. The results were shocking. Radiation levels above the turbine building's ventilation stack reached 3 roentgens per hour. Inside the containment structure, the radiation was so intense it could kill a person in just a few minutes. All this time, the government, fearing mass panic, kept assuring the public that there was no danger, that everything was under control. But behind the scenes, the truth was very different. On the night of March 29th to 30th, Governor Thornburg faced the hardest decision of his life. Should he order the evacuation of 500,000 people living near the plant or not? He knew what such an announcement would mean. Highways jammed with cars, mass panic among the population, and hospitals struggling to move their patients to safety. But he also knew if a hydrogen explosion did occur, the consequences would be far worse. Whatever he chose, one thing was certain: his career would never be the same again. On the second day of the accident, the morning of March 30th, Governor Thornburg, after consulting with nuclear experts, held a press conference. He recommended that only pregnant women and children from the 5-mile, 8-kilometer zone evacuate. In total, about 40,000 residents were advised to leave the area. But panic spread quickly. Over 100,000 people fled the zone, plus another 100,000 from neighboring counties. By the morning of April 1st, the 5th day after the accident, President Jimmy Carter decided to visit the nuclear power plant personally. His goal was to calm the public and show that the situation was fully under control, even though the risk of an explosion still existed. Carter, however, was well informed about nuclear energy and knew far more than the average citizen. He listened to the scientists' reports and toured the control room himself. At the same time, the work to safely vent the accumulated hydrogen, which had been ongoing for several days, was finally successfully completed. And it happened that very day during the president's visit. Finally, the situation at the nuclear power plant came fully under control. According to the official report, no one was killed during the accident, and by miracle, no one received a significant dose of radiation. Radioactive particles, primarily xenon-133 and iodine-131, leaked through numerous breaches into the auxiliary building of the reactor. From there, they entered the surrounding environment through the ventilation system. Thanks to adsorption filters, the actual release was minimal. According to estimates, the activity of the released iodine did not exceed 15 curies, while xenon reached approximately 2.5 million curies. The greatest negative impact, however, was not from radiation itself, but from panic among the population, fueled by conflicting reports in the media. The accident triggered a nationwide public outcry, sparking anti-nuclear movements and protests across the country. By a remarkable coincidence, just 2 weeks before the accident, the legendary film The China Syndrome was released. In the movie, journalists attempt to uncover violations during the construction of a fictional nuclear power plant and warn the public that it is unsafe. One character even utters a fateful line, that radioactive contamination could render an area the size of Pennsylvania uninhabitable forever. By the end of 1981, the reactor's temperature had dropped enough to allow the complete shutdown of the circulation pumps. Decontamination work on the second reactor unit began in the mid-1980s and was completed by 1990, although it was not entirely successful. During the decontamination, the reactor was fully dismantled and all radioactive waste was sent for storage in the auxiliary rooms attached to the reactor. In rooms with hollow walls, workers had to chip away layers of concrete as radioactive particles had penetrated deeply through microcracks. Dust was collected using vacuum systems, and in areas with extremely high contamination, remote-controlled equipment was used. Even today, radiation levels remain elevated in the second reactor's rooms. Its full dismantling along with the first reactor is not scheduled until at least 2034. The second reactor had been commissioned in December 1978 and operated for less than 6 months.